often put horrific headlines over the heads of slumping players. Like Alex Pujols' slump, the most expensive in Major League Baseball history. A-Rod's slump, killing Yankees. David had a horrific headline hanging over his head too. At the very end of 2 Samuel 11, we read the sentence, here's the headline, "The thing David had done displeased the Lord." That's a horrific headline. And we have a tendency to put some self-imposed headlines over our heads too. Destined for mediocrity. Stuck in a perpetual spiritual slump. Well, there are several things that start us into the slump. Here are some slump starters. Past regret, present sin, future fear. Past regret. Sometimes we look back in the rearview mirror and feel shame. There's something in our past that we did and shouldn't have done, or didn't do and should have done, and it causes shame, gets us into the slump. Maybe it's a present sin that launches us into the slump. Maybe we hold on to a sin or two, like Gollum held on to the ring in Lord of the Rings, his precious. And the ring or the sin we hold on to has the potential to destroy us. It might be a future fear that launches us into the slump. Anxiety about tomorrow prohibits present progress. Well, regardless of what gets us into the slump, because we're 21st century people, we have a tendency to think we can work our way out of the slump. But if we're the ones who got ourselves into the slump in the first place, chances are we need a force outside of us to pull us out. When you have your car stuck in a muddy rut, the last thing you want to do is step on the gas. It'll just wedge the tires deeper and deeper and deeper. You need a force outside of you to pull you out. You need a tow truck of grace. So did David, and he got one. In 2 Samuel 12, there's a new chapter that opens up for David. Again, at the very end of that terrible, horrible, no good, very bad chapter in his life, 2 Samuel 11, we read that horrific headline, "The thing that David had done displeased the Lord." What we might expect as the next sentence, 2 Samuel 12:1, is something like, so God abandoned David, or God gave up on David, or God rained down fire from heaven to destroy David. But that's not what we read. What we read is, instead, the Lord sent Nathan to David. These two sentences together encapsulate the gospel so well. The end of 2 Samuel 11, the problem of the human condition, the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. 2 Samuel 12:1, the next sentence, the good news of God's grace. The Lord sent Nathan to David. How do you stop a runaway train like David? How do you disrupt his degeneration? With the force of grace. That's how. Well, God, through the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 12, does some relationship recounting with David. He basically says to David, you were a nobody and I made you a somebody. You were just a shepherd boy. I made you a king. I've blessed you with everything I could possibly bless you with. And then God says to David through Nathan, if all that had been too little, David, I would have given you more. And how does David repay the grace of God in his life, the blessings of God? Well, God says these hard words to David. He says, but David, I blessed you, but you despised my word and you despised me. The Hebrew word for despise is beza. It means to accord little value or worth to someone or something. It's the same word actually that we read when it says Goliath despised David. In the same way Goliath accorded little value or worth to David, David accorded little value and worth to God. How does God repay David? With grace. 2 Samuel 12 is chock full of grace, but especially as we get to the end of the chapter, which doesn't get a whole lot of press, verses 24 to 31. It's just chock full of grace upon grace upon grace. I love that verse in John 1:16. It says that. It says, Out of the fullness of Christ, we have all received grace upon grace. If you go to the end of 2 Samuel 12, you see this grace. For starters, verse 24, David and Bathsheba get married, have another child, and God says to give the child the name Jedediah, which means loved by God. This couple, whose initial coming together was adulterous, has a child that's loved by God. Grace upon grace upon grace. And then a few verses later, Joab, David's army commander and friend, is out fighting David's battles while David is bored in his boxers devouring Doritos in the palace. And Joab is about to take the royal city of the Ammonites. But Joab knows if he takes the royal city, the city will be named after him, not David. So he sends word to David saying, basically, listen, the battle's pretty much won, but I need you to get on your armor, come and finish the battle so the city is named after you, not me. A friend like that, who's more concerned about David's reputation than his own resume, is a grace upon grace upon grace. And then we get to the end of the chapter, and David throws on his armor. It's a little tight, has a hard time fitting it over his beer belly. Again, he's been bored in his boxers in the palace. He's rusty, hasn't fought in a long time, but he goes out to the royal city and finishes the battle, and he still got it. He still got the gift God gave him. Grace upon grace upon grace. Perhaps the most significant grace in David's life was the fact that he was not known for that horrific headline, the thing David had done displeased the Lord. He's most known for the phrase we find in Scripture, David was a man after God's own heart, whose poetic prayers called the Psalms have inspired billions of people throughout the ages, whose name is listed in the Hebrews 11 Hall of Faith with some of the other heroes like Moses and Abraham. The Lord sent Nathan to David. Grace upon grace upon grace. Here's what I know about God. He will find a way to disrupt your degeneration, to pull you out of the slump by sending you a Nathan of grace. Maybe that Nathan is correction, conviction, or comfort. Maybe that Nathan is a sermon, a song, a movie, a painting. Maybe that Nathan is a friend who, over a cup of coffee, asks you sincerely, how is it with your soul? Or a spouse who asks you lovingly penetrating questions. God will find a way to disrupt your degeneration with a Nathan of grace. When my son, Zach, was moved up to Little League Baseball, he struggled with a slump. When he was in coach's pitch, which is really machine pitch, the ball came in at the same speed and the same spot every time. It was really predictable. And Zach could just stand there and, with his eyes closed even, swing the bat as hard as he could, and he would slug the ball. But then when he moved up to Little League, the machine wasn't pitching anymore. Now it's kids pitching. And they're throwing the ball all over the place, mostly at Zach's head. In his first game in Little League, he got hit with the pitch twice. And so for the rest of the season, Zach was in a slump. Every time the ball was coming to him when he was up at bat, he would back out about 5 yards and still swing. Again, home plate was like 5 yards from him. He was never going to hit the ball. And I would yell out, Zach, stay in there. Don't bail out. The ball's not going to hurt if it hits you. And he would just, sort of look at me like, yeah, easy for you to say, Dad. He was in a slump the whole season. And I remember wishing that I could jump into Zach's body and do for him what he couldn't do for himself, to get him out of his slump. And what I couldn't do for Zach, God through Christ did for us. God saw the human race stuck in a spiritual slump, and he jumped into our flesh, blood, and bone and did for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. He took all kinds of pitches on the chin. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. The Lord didn't just send Nathan to David. The Lord sent Jesus to us. Grace upon grace upon grace.